Hello, my name is Jakob.
And my name is Judith, and you are listening to our podcast, Wannsee, looking at the international dimensions of the Holocaust. Today we are talking about another country which is mentioned in the Wannsee Protocol. It's Greece.
At the beginning of the German occupation in 1941, about 68,000 Jews lived in Greece. Most of the Jews in Greece were so-called Sephardic Jews, so they were descendants of Spanish Jews who found refuge in the Ottoman Empire after being expelled from Spain in the 15th century. They built synagogues and schools, laying the foundation for a growing community with their own culture and language of Judeo-Spanish or Ladino.
The biggest Jewish community in Greece and also on the Balkans lived in Salonika, which is today known as Thessaloniki. Before the Nazi occupation, 70% of the Jewish community in Greece lived in Salonika. In 1900, they made half of the city's population. The poet Samuel Usk referred to Salonika as the Jerusalem of the Balkans as early as the 16th century. Salonika, the center of Jewish life in Greece, was almost completely destroyed by the Germans. For this reason, we want to focus our episode on the city and community there.
Joining us today is Maria Vasilikou. She wrote her thesis on the politics of the Jewish community of Salonika in the interwar years. She taught modern European and Jewish history on several universities and published articles on many topics on the Jewish community in Salonika and also in Odessa. She's, among others, co-author of volume 14 of the documentary edition Verfolgung und Ermordung der europäischen Juden that is currently translated to English. As of February 2019, she has been working as a researcher on matters regarding the Holocaust and Holocaust education at the Jewish Museum of Greece in Athens. Welcome at Wannsee, Maria.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be with you today.
So, in 1912, Greek troops conquered Salonika that had been part of the Ottoman Empire for more than 400 years. And Greeks were only one of the communities of Salonika. The biggest community in Salonika was the Jewish community. Then there was a big Muslim community, and only in the third place, Greeks, and there were also Bulgarians. How did the situation of the Jews of Salonika change in 1912? They had been part of the multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire and found themselves now as part of a Greek nation state. So what did change for them?
Yes, well, as you properly stated, 1912 was the turning point for the life of the Jewish community of Thessaloniki. Until that moment, the Jews of Thessaloniki had the chance to develop a very prominent communal status. They had excelled in trade. They had set up many schools, and they had a very vast spectrum of cultural activities. The Judeo-Spanish theater evolved in Thessaloniki. Many newspapers circulated amongst the Jewish community of Thessaloniki in different languages, in Judeo-Spanish, in French, also some in Hebrew, as far as the Zionist wind of change started blowing in the city. And when the Greek troops entered Thessaloniki, the community had really a very solid and a very autark and a very pride profile, communal profile. The community has profited immensely from the wind of modernization and westernization that blew in the Ottoman Empire as of the end of the 19th century. So the port of Thessaloniki grew immensely, railway stations, connected the city with Vienna, with Monastir, with Belgrade, with Istanbul. And through this extended railway network, the merchandise that had been produced from Salonika Jewish factories, but also had arrived in Salonika as an import trade, could be then forward to the other European commercial centers. And the Jews were really very prominent in this trade business. At the same time, there were many Jews who had been part of the socialist movement, which is the first socialist movement that developed in the Sephardi world, and it was set up by Avram Ben Aroya, a Jew who came from Bulgaria to Thessaloniki. And this major trade unionist movement, the first socialist movement, as I already said, comprised more than 6,000 Jewish workers. So we have the bourgeoisie, we have the proletarian Jews, and we also have the Zionist Jews in Thessaloniki who had been also enchanted by the Zionist vision and wanted to put this vision into, to make this vision become true. So all these issues along political, cultural, and economic lines were completely overthrown when Salonika, became Greek in 1912. However, for the period between 1912 until 1922, we cannot speak about a solid set of relationship between the community and the Greek state, because in this period of almost longer than 10 years, the Greek state was very much engaged in military escapades with the Balkan wars, then the First World War, then the Asia Minor campaign, and it didn't have the time and the power and the energy to deal with the integration, assimilation of the big ethnic minorities that had been comprised into the Greek state as a result of Salonika's integration into Greece. However, during this period from 1912 until 1924, many things happened that showed that the relations in the city between Jews and non-Jews, I prefer to say not Greeks and Jews, but Jews and non-Jews, were really wanting. And were found wanting these relationships, like the eruption of anti-Semitic episodes when the Greek army entered the city in 1912. Then it was the Great Fire that happened in Thessaloniki in 1917, and the deadliest blow was dealt upon the Jewish community, which resided the lower part of the city, which was almost 100% distracted by the fire, and more than 50,000 Jews were left homeless. And with a new urbanization program of the city, these Jews were somehow forced to leave the center of the town where they used to have their businesses and dwell in the suburbs of the city. So that was also a blow, not only a material blow to the accommodation, but also to the economic life of the community. And then the last thing that happened was we have in 1921 the blood libel accusation in the eve of the Easter holiday that showed also the ugly face of Greek anti-Semitism. So all these things were new for the Jews of Thessaloniki. And as a result, the first impulsive reaction was the exodus. So many Jews, especially the ones who could speak French and Italy, decided to leave the city and settle in France, especially in Paris, or even go back to Italy. So there was a hemorrhage of vital economic elements from within the community, which in a way, at the same time, deprived the community of communal taxes. And that made also the economic profile of the community more weak compared to what it used to be before. So 1912 was really the turning point.
You already mentioned it. There was a Greco-Turkish war in 1919 to 1922. And then there was a huge influx of Greek refugees to Thessaloniki. So how did that especially change the relation to Greeks and the Jews, or to non-Jews? And because the Greek minority got bigger at that point.
Exactly. More than 150,000 Greek refugees came and settled in Thessaloniki. And thus was also part of the Hellenization program that was put forward by the liberal Venizelist governments of the period. Because we should not forget Salonika is stationed in the northern provinces of the country. And at this moment, there were revisionist neighboring movements contesting the Greek character of Thessaloniki. So Venizelos and his governments, Venizelos, the Greek statesman of the period, did all he could to forcify, to make more, to strengthen, let's say, it's a better word, to strengthen the Greek profile of the area. So the settlement of the refugees was in a way a deliberate movement, and automatically the numerical preponderance was overthrown. The Jews were no longer the majority, as you said before, and they were at the same time weakened because of the Great Fire of 1917, when they have lost almost all their belongings and their businesses, which were stationed in the center of the city. And immediately a competition started between the refugees as the newcomers against the Jews, the old guard, concerning accommodation, concerning working positions. And that paved the way for the emergence of anti-Semitic and proto-fascist and fascist groups in Thessaloniki.
Mm-hmm. You already mentioned Hellenization, and I think it's worth mentioning that this is against the background of the population exchange between Greece and Turkey after a bloody 4-year war that the Turks call the War of Independence, after the First World War, that saw massacres not only of Armenians but also of Greeks and other minorities in the Ottoman Empire, and vice versa in the Balkan Wars. So what were the policies of Hellenization of the Greek state towards the Jewish community? Did the Jews enjoy certain religious and cultural freedoms? Could they speak their own language, Judeo-Spanish? Because many Jews in Thessaloniki didn't speak Greek at the time, or didn't speak it very well. Was there mainly a negative attitude? Especially I read that Sunday was introduced as a day of rest in 1924 instead of the Saturday that had been traditionally the day of rest in Thessaloniki. Could you say something about that?
Yes, of course. Well, the period starting after the Treaty of the Lausanne, after the signature of the Lausanne Treaty in 1924, until 1936, when we have the establishment of the Metaxas dictatorship. It's the interwar years. And this could be, as far as the Greek policies towards the Jews are concerned, could be divided into three categories along timelines. So the first period is from 1924 until 1928. And during this period, the Greek state, the official majority policies, had a rather legalistic frame. So laws were passed which influenced the hitherto status of the community. As you rightly said, until that moment, the Jews had the right to rest on Saturday and to work on Sunday. Under the pressure of the refugee groups, the Sunday closing day became an obligatory rest for all inhabitants of the city in 1924. And this was contrary to the affirmation that Venizelos had made to the Jews immediately after the entry of the Greek troops in Thessaloniki in 1912. So that's the Sunday closing day. The second thing is slowly but steadily, they integrated the Jews into the Greek army. Until that moment, they could pay an exemption task and being released from the military service. But this situation changed, and as of, I think, mid-1920s, the Jews had to serve in the Greek army. That was, again, a change, promoting Hellenization and integration of the Jews into the Greek state. Then in 1923, a separate electoral college was introduced where the Jews could vote in the parliamentary and the Senate elections, but in a different electoral college, so that the liberal governments could be certain that this compact ethnic bloc vote would not be thrown behind the anti-Venizelist camp. And this is something that, again, the Jews thought is a discriminatory measure. At the same time, Venizelos could portray himself towards the European fora, that in this way the Jews was certain that they would be able to elect their own candidate, because if they would vote with all the others, probably a Jewish candidate would not be voted. But if they had their own electoral college, that could safeguard the election of a Jewish political leader. And that was very important for Venizelos to to show a benevolent profile towards France and England, because at this time Greece was very weakened because of these years of fighting, needed badly a lot of money to accommodate and rehabilitate the Asia Minor refugees. So, and this could only happen if Venizelos and his government showed that he comply with the international minority treaties which had been voted in 1920. So the thing in Thessaloniki is we witness a schism, we could say, between Athens and Thessaloniki. So there were regional forces in Thessaloniki which acted differently to the capital political forces from Athens. And this somehow shows how inextricably interwoven the fate of the Jewish community of the city was with the history of the city itself. And then as of 1928, and the things change, and majority policies become more, I would say, become more anti-Jewish. The emergence of fascist groups is being tolerated. The anti-Semitic tirades of sections of the Greek press are being tolerated and sometimes even encouraged by local Greek officials. And we have 1931, the pogrom against the poor Jewish neighborhood of Campbell.
Mm. Before we go to the pogrom, let's talk about anti-Semitism in the 1920s and up to the 1930s. In our last episode about Turkey with Cory Gutstadt, we talked about Christian anti-Semitism in that region. And Christian anti-Semitism was also very present in Greece because the Orthodox Church had a lot of power. So could you maybe tell us what was the role of the Orthodox Church during that period, and how present was Christian anti-Semitism?
Yes. Well, in Greek society, like any other Christian society, we trace many ontological and cosmological beliefs that somehow tend to be so self-evident that nobody questions them and becomes part of the nation's popular luggage. And one of these beliefs that is being somehow accepted without questioning is the characterization of the Jews as the deicide people responsible for Jesus' crucifixion. And this stereotypical image of the Jew is being witnessed in folk songs, in the Greek shadow theater. The Jews are being portrayed as lepers and as misers, and as Jewish women as witches. So we have all this spectrum of anti-Semitic stereotypes running Greek popular culture. Very related to this is the way in which some Greeks perceive the Passion during the Holy Week that takes place in the churches. They really perceive it very personally, and they express sincere they express sincere feelings of mourning for Jesus' crucifixion. And this somehow can erupt into a very, how should I say it, it really brings upside down the Greek Orthodox consciousness amongst these people visiting the church during those days. And it is no accident, I think, that the pogrom in Athens, 1847, the pogrom in Kerkyra and in Zakynthos, 1891, both happened during the Holy Week, when passions are running really high. And also at the same period, we also witness the anti-Semitic custom of the burning of Judas.
That was very recently, I think 10 years ago.
It still takes place. It still takes place, and the official Greek Church has issued 3 decrees in order to forbid it as of 1891 until later, and it hasn't achieved anything. So this custom does still take place in Greece, and it's a popular anti-Semitism. We cannot say in Greece that the official church somehow has to do with it. It's the way the ordinary people experience this cultural transmission of Jesus' crucifixion during the Holy Week. Mm-hmm. And I have to quote here a very nice, I find it very surrealistic, position represented by Yorgos Ioannou. Yorgos Ioannou is an author coming from Salonika. He's very well rooted into the city. And I find it very nice what he has said about Greek anti-Semitism. I quote, and the translation in English is done by me. The still fluid neo-Greek society, bedeviled in its unbearable misfortune, did not have the time or the power to master in its soul the poisonous luxury of anti-Semitism and racial discriminations. It was simply uninterested, and it still is. It has other longings. It's very surrealistic, but I think it touches upon the issue of this popular anti-Semitism in Greece, which has never reached the level of racial official anti-Semitism like we know from other countries.
Mm-hmm. But let's come to the Campbell pogrom of 1931 that you mentioned. I read that the leader of the anti-Semitic group of I think it's the EEE, that he spoke better Turk than Greek because he came from Asia Minor. Maybe you can tell us something about this Campbell riots against the Jewish population there, and they were also not the rich people who were living there, and what was the background of these riots?
That brings us back to the issues we have touched upon before, namely the emergence of the fascist groups in Thessaloniki, which were mostly set up by young people coming from the refugee strata of the society. So as of 1927, the Τρία Epsilon, what you said, the 3 E's, Ethniική Ένωση Ελλάς, was set up in Thessaloniki, and its leader was Kosmidis, who came from Asia. His origins were in Asia Minor, and that was the fascist groups, and they had a fierce anti-Semitic and nationalistic and xenophobic content in their ideology. At the same time, we have the role of the press. The newspaper Macedonia was never stopped publishing anti-Semitic tirades against the Jewish community in Thessaloniki. And the pretext for the Campbell riots was the rumor that circulated in June 1931 that a representative of the Salonika Maccabi Society participated into the meeting of the Maccabi Sports Association that took place in Sofia. And he was accused of having participated also at the meeting of Bulgarian nationalists who also held their meetings in Sofia at the same time, and during which they had encouraged, or they had spoken in favor for the creation of an autonomous Macedonia. So this rumor circulated, and the nationalist circles were really outraged why the Jewish representative of the Maccabi Salonika did not oppose such a claim done by the Bulgarian nationalists in Sofia. That was not the case. That was clarified. Mr. Cohen had never been in this Bulgarian meeting, so it was a rumor, a false, fake news.
Fake news, yeah.
Fake news, exactly. But still, it was enough to stir up the anti-Semitic and nationalist passions of these fascist groups. The first attack was against the offices of the Maccabi Society in Thessaloniki, causing very serious damages to the offices. And I don't know if you have heard about the book published by Elena Huzuri, Onkel Avram bleibt hier. It is published in German by the Griechenland Zeitung Verlag, and she touches really upon this pogrom in a very nice literary way. It's the first time I read that, so I can really recommend reading this book when you want to find less historic and more literary approach.
We can also put that in our show notes, so
exactly.
We can link that.
Yes, yeah. Onkel Abraham bleibt immer hier, genau. And so these rumors started. It was like a ball of fire that some nationalists they concentrated, and more joined them all the way. And at the end, it was around 2,000 people, comprising Greek reservists from the Greek army, comprising nationalist students and members of the Tria Epsilon, the 3 E's. And they put the poor Jewish neighborhood of Campbell into fire. And the tragedy was 2 people lost their lives. The one was a Jewish peddler, very, very poor people. And the other one was an Orthodox Greek baker who had refused to hide in his bakery the fuel that the nationalist circles wanted to have in order to be able to put fire later. And he was then shot. These were the 2 casualties. And it's important to know that the perpetrators were stood trial 1932 in Veria, and they were all acquitted, and nobody was found guilty.
Wow.
Okay, let's go deeper into the 1930s. In 1933, the National Socialists came to power in Germany. And a few years later, in 1936, Ioannis Metaxas took power in Greece. He had good relations with Nazi Germany, and he installed a dictatorship that clearly showed some characteristics of fascist regimes in other countries. What would you say? Was he also an anti-Semite, and how would you describe his regime?
First, let's delineate the profile of the Metaxas dictatorship very, very roughly and put it into relation to the fascist regimes we know from Germany and Italy. Metaxas in his dictatorship called for a national rebirth of the nation, which should be based on three main pillars, namely cultural loans from the Greek antiquity, from Sparta, from Alexander the Great, and from the Byzantine Empire. That was the first cultural loans from them. The second was to have material modesty and respect welfare structures. And the third was to succeed to have to accomplish the unity between peasants, workers, and the bourgeoisie. That was the three pillars destined to give birth to the rebirth of the nation. There were certain similarities with the German fascism, the Italian fascism. In 1936, in September, just 1 month after the imposition of the dictatorship, we have the burning of books in different Greek cities, Thessaloniki, Piraeus. And amongst the books to be burned, like we know from Germany, there were not just the complete works of Karl Marx, but also the works of the big Russian authors, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Gorky, the works of Sigmund Freud, the works of Bernard Shaw and Anatole France, but also the works of very popular Greek authors like Kazantzakis, like Zacharias Papadoniou, like Alexandros Papadiamandis, Andreas Karkavitsas. So they were all damned to be burned. That is a parallel with the fascist regime abroad. Then he also set up the workers' battalions, the equivalent of the Sturmabteilung in Nazi Germany. Of course, he oppressed and he persecuted in a very vehement way more than 40,000 communists and political dissidents, and throw them into prison or sent them to the exile islands. Goebbels visited Athens in 1936, and at the same time, the National Union, the National Organization of the Youth, was set up, like the Hitlerjugend we know from Nazi Germany. At the same time, however, the Metaxas dictatorship did not demonstrate this Führerkult we know from Germany. Metaxas was himself a very moderate and introvert personality, and he didn't fancy such fussy and mass phenomena. And he preferred mostly for him the title of the father of the nation. And I remember having read a report written by the British Consul in Athens, 1936, to the Foreign Office in London, trying to calm down his colleagues in the Central Foreign Office, telling them, we don't have to worry about the Metaxas dictatorship. It doesn't have this mass scale of mobilization like we know from Italy or from Germany. And last but not least, as far as anti-Semitic feelings are concerned, which you asked me, definitely he was no anti-Semite. He did all he could in order to forbid the Tria Epsilon, the 3 E's organization. He put, which indeed 1937 was dissolved. He also put an end to the anti-Semitic tirades published by sections of the anti-Semitic press, and he was in contact with the chief rabbi of Thessaloniki, Tzvi Koretz, and for his benevolent attitude towards the Jews, he was registered in the Libro d'Oro of the Jewish National Fund.
Yeah, that's very interesting that when Venizelos said that the Jews, they can't be Greek, they will always stay Jewish, they can't be integrated and so on, he had a very different stance. So there we have a liberal who was very outspoken anti-Semite, at least in the beginning of the 1930s, and someone who was clearly with fascist tendencies, to say it mildly, who was not an outspoken anti-Semite. So that's very special. So the 1930s, with their authoritarian regimes, in a way, were better for the Jewish community than the liberal age in the 1920s. So let's come to the Second World War. In October 1940, Italian troops invaded Greece, but they were soon repelled by the Greek army. And in April 1941, the Germans had to come to the aid of their Italian allies, and Greece was occupied.
The largest part, including the capital Athens, was occupied by the Italians. But the northern parts, including Thessaloniki, with the largest Jewish community of the country, was occupied by German forces. Some other parts were also occupied by Bulgaria.
And the occupation led to a catastrophic shortage of food. Tens of thousands, if not 100,000 of Greeks died in the first winter alone of the occupation.
So, Maria, could you maybe tell us what were the first measures the Germans took against the Jewish population, and how did the Greeks respond to it?
Yes, well, the Nazi policy towards the Jews of Thessaloniki during the occupation years could be divided into three phases. The first phase is from the beginning until July 1942, when the Nazis forbade the circulation of the Jewish papers, albeit all the papers circulating, not just the Jewish ones. So no Jewish paper was circulating. They dissolved the Jewish communal bodies. They confiscated Jewish property in Thessaloniki. Nice Jewish villas were confiscated for German officers to be able to live inside. And slowly, signs started appearing in Thessaloniki with the motto, Jews are not welcome, Juden nicht willkommen. And the Rosenberg Sonderkommando von Alfred Rosenberg raided the German occupation zone, and confiscated archives, confiscated the whole wealth of the Jewish communal bodies, confiscated the data that were to be found in the Jewish libraries. And as it has done in other occupied countries, this whole wealth was transported back to Frankfurt. So these were the major things, but there was not a clear anti-Semitic oppressive policy in terms of persecuting them.
Yeah, and we have to mention that in the autumn of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen shot hundreds of thousands of Jewish civilians on the soil of the occupied Soviet Union. And in Serbia, that was very close to Greece, already all the Jewish men had been shot by the Wehrmacht, by the German army. But in Greece, there was anti-Semitism by the German occupier, but not as brutal, not as violent as in other occupied territories. So you said already July 1942 was a turning point. So the Germans ordered Jewish men to assemble on the central Freedom Place, the Platia Eleftherias. I don't know, my Greek is not existing.
Perfect.
And they were humiliated in plain public. We know that because a German photographer took lots of photographs and documented how Jews were beaten, how they had to perform gymnastics. Was this day, so you already said this day was a turning point. How did the local population react to that? Because this was in one of the central places for everyone to see, for everyone to take even pictures.
Yes, that's exactly the point. The Greek local population, the non-Jews, did not react at all. So they were looking at what was happening in Platia Eleftherias and did not do anything. I mean, the question is, what could they do? They could have done something. The Greek resistance was at the moment quite in its adult phase. So there is a little understanding for probably not on this very day, but after that, trying to help their Jewish co-citizens. So, and this is exactly, probably it was also a testing tube for the Nazis to find out how would the non-Jews react should they proceed with the persecution measures they had in their luggage. And they understood that it was somehow okay. They took the green light to proceed with the persecution measures.
On the 6th of December 1942, the municipality of Salonika started with the demolition of the Jewish cemetery that had been one of the largest Jewish cemeteries in Europe, and you wrote a lot about that. Was this a sign that everyone in Salonika knew that the Germans intended to destroy the Jewish community?
I mean, the destruction of the Jewish cemetery of the Saloniki was, so to say, a very sad collateral damage that accompanied the agreement of paying the ransom for setting free the Jewish men who had been forced to forced labor on the heels of the 11th July events. And in order to be able, for the community to be able to set them free, the community was blackmailed. And in its negotiations with Max Merton, and it had to agree in the end to pay the big amount of money plus deliver the Jewish cemetery to the Greek administration body.
Yeah, Max Merton was a German official, Kriegsverwaltungsrat or something like that, who also played after the war a role. But this was still the German army. But on February 6, 1943, Dieter Wisliceni and Alois Brunner, both SS officers that belonged to Adolf Eichmann's office, arrived with about 100 German police officers, and they began immediately to prepare for the deportation of the Jews. And already on March 15, 1943, the first deportation train left Salonika, and until August 1943, almost all the Jews of Salonika had been deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Only very few survived. And the question is, how can we explain that the Germans succeeded so fast to deport this biggest Jewish community on the Balkans and in Greece?
First of all, Jakob, it definitely has to do with the unrelenting intention of the Nazis to implement the final solution, namely to persecute and exterminate the Jews living in their zone of occupation. And this is, I think, the number one factor. And at the moment, Thessaloniki was also the seat of the Befehlshaber Saloniki Aegeis, which was really the stronghold of German military forces. And this intention and this commitment of the Nazis to implement the final solution was that unrelentless. I think it's the most telling example, the fact that even in July and August 1944, when everything was clear that the war was lost and the Allies had landed in Normandy, they did not refrain from deporting the 1,600 Jews from Rhodes, and even making the ship stop over at Leros to pick up the only Jewish inhabitant of the island and then come to Piraeus, load them in those death trains and bring them to Auschwitz-Birkenau. So that was really their intention, and they wanted with full power to accomplish it. At the same time, the Jewish community itself was an ethnic minority which was in the process of Hellenization and linguistic assimilation as far as the learning of the Greek language is concerned. But they still could not speak in their majority very well Greek. So they couldn't hide very well, and they couldn't pretend being somebody else. We have the example of, I think her name is Sterina Gattegno, a Salonican woman who hid herself in Athens, and everybody thought she's mute because she never spoke. And when the liberation took place in October 1944, and she came out and she started celebrating, her neighbors were completely surprised because they thought until that time that the woman cannot speak. And she said in very broken Greek, "I am Jewish, I'm not mute." So it was very difficult for them to hide and to hide. That was the only chance. And of course, the anti-Semitism in Thessaloniki, the Greeks were not, the non-Jews, the Christian Greeks were not willing in their majority to do that much about their Jewish compatriots, so to say.
And this was also because the Germans did all they could to implicate them economically in the plunder of Jewish goods. So the Chamber of Commerce and so on was part of a committee that looted Jewish shops and distributed them among non-Jews. So they had a lot of incentives not to do anything about the deportation of their Jewish compatriots.
Exactly. The Nazis somehow applied a welfare policy, so to bring the non-Jews into non-action towards the persecution of their Jewish compatriots. And the resistance at that moment also held a very low profile towards the possibility of rescuing the Jews, which was not the case during the second phase of the persecution of the Greek Jews as of September 1943, when the resistance became much more active in rescuing Jews.
And in Athens, the Archbishop Damiskinos protested against the deportations. But in Salonika, nothing like that happened. So what is the difference between the two cities?
Yes. My dearest colleague, Odette Varon-Vassar, has coined Salonika as the city of extinction and Athens as the city of survival, which is probably Athens one of the few examples where the Jewish population after the war has doubled compared to the population, the Jewish population before the war, because so many Jews had found refuge in the Italian-occupied city, because the Italians refrain from applying anti-Semitic methods. And actually that was the reason why probably the Germans took that long to start with the application of the final solution measures. And in Thessaloniki, we have some lukewarm protests from Greek officials, but the basic protest voices came from Athens, as you rightly said. It was Archbishop Damaskinos with his famous memorandum signed by another 29 representatives of commerce and cultural circles of the country, but nothing happened. Yes. Came too late.
You already mentioned that, the remarkable role of the Italians, because Jews fled to the Italian zones because there they were more or less protected from persecution by the Germans. And in Salonika itself, Gelfo Zamboni, the Italian consul general of Salonika, managed to help 500 Jews out of Salonika, and hundreds of them without an Italian passport. So this is an example of the role of some, of course, not of all Italians, which is also very important to understand the differences between Salonika, that was occupied by the Germans, and Athens, that was occupied by the Italians.
You did a lot of researches with Greek documents. So what kind of documents do we have about the deportations? What kind of documents from the perspective of the Jews, not of the perpetrators?
Yes, I think that's a very interesting question, because we don't have, unlike other European countries, that many documents coming from the Jews, women and men. So we are very grateful for having found even a handful of such personal documents attesting to the history of the deportation. And one of these document is a letter I would like to share with you today, written by Neama Kazes. She was a Jewish woman from Salonika who got trapped in Salonika. She wanted to go to Athens. She had already found a domicile in Athens. Her one son was already waiting for her in Athens. She went back to Thessaloniki to pack her things with her other son, and they were found in the mid of the application of the anti-Semitic measures by the Nazis, so they couldn't flee. They were trapped with her son, and then her son managed somehow to go to Athens. So she stayed alone in Thessaloniki, and in 11 letters we have in the Jewish Museum of Greece, written in French. Yes, she pours her grief and her fear towards the situation taking place at that moment, and also towards the situation that she's about to experience. My dearest Maurice and Berto, these days I'm writing you a letter to reassure you a little bit, despite all the agony we feel, morning and night waiting like convicts for the death sentence. For a moment we had the illusion that we escaped this difficult hour, but things are moving fast. The fateful moment arrives in a few days or hours for me too. My dear children, in spite of my efforts not to make you sad, I see that my last hour has come. Nothing comforts me anymore when I see myself away from my dear children, my loved ones, whom I wanted and longed to see, my only ones. May the God who sees my tears have mercy and protect you. Nothing can describe the tragedy that is happening here. I, who expected to see you from one moment to the next, am running with a sack on my back in the direction of the unknown. Do not stop thinking of me. I'm suffering tremendously. God will show mercy to me so that I do not get sick if they do not exterminate me, because what we see is not very encouraging. April 1st, 1943, Neama Kazes was deported in the last April train to Auschwitz-Birkenau and was immediately murdered in the gas chamber. She was only 54 years old.
Very touching. And 11 letters are left by the sons.
Letters she had written to her sons.
Okay.
Yes.
And they survived, so they could.
They survived, yes. Now we have them in the Jewish Museum of Greece in Athens. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because the numbers of survivors are so low. I mean, there are just about 15% or something who actually survived, because Thessaloniki was such a central Jewish community in Greece, and it was really radical how fast they started the deportation. So the Jews of Greece were murdered very fast. How were the little numbers of Greek survivors treated after the war? And another question also about that, how dealt Greece with the collaborators after 1945?
Yes. Well, the first question is easier than the second to answer. Concerning the very few Jewish survivors of the Holocaust in Greece. So before the war, there were, Jakob was already mentioning, something like 77,000 people of Jewish faith live in Greece. After the war, there were 8. I think as in terms of percentage, is probably the second to Poland concerning the extermination rate of the Jewish inhabitants Greece. These people that survived, you can imagine they were confronted with very serious problems and very deep traumata. They had lost their families, they had experienced the concentration camps, some had experienced immense difficulties in the mountains with the resistance. They were confronted with a number of challenges. They had to deal with their traumata, they had to deal with the loss of their beloved ones, their properties. They had to make choices, what to do afterwards. And their choices were depending on, I think, the factors I can enumerate to you roughly. The anti-Semitic environment in which they were embedded after the war, the experiences they had with anti-Semitism before the war, the extent to which they could restart their lives in terms of having a work and an occupation. At the same time, Greece's official stance towards the establishment of the State of Israel. Greece has voted against the establishment of the State of Israel, was not very encouraging for the Jewish survivors. At the same time, there was a Greek law that passed and obliged all Greek men under 40 years old to do the military service. And that was also not very pleasant for somebody who has experienced the war and who has experienced the concentration camp to go now to the Greek army. And of course, it was the Greek Civil War that took place on the heels of the German occupation that made the situation even more explosive. So when faced with all these dilemmata, most of these, many Jews decided to leave Greece and emigrate firstly to the newly established State of Israel as of 1948, or to Australia, South America, South Africa, and also to Canada, not Congo, Canada. Many people also went to Canada, and by the early 1950s, something like 5,000 Jews were living in Greece, which is more or less the number of Jews living in Greece nowadays. Before the war, we had 26 Jewish communities dispersed all over the country. Now we have 8 organized Jewish communities, with Thessaloniki being the community with the largest Jewish population, and then Salonika in the second place. And
so Athens is the greatest.
Yes, yes. And the third community is that of Larissa.
Well, maybe one last question. It's in my personal interest. What happened to the place of the Jewish cemetery in Thessaloniki?
Yes.
After 1945.
Yes. The Aristoteles University was erected
where I studied for one semester.
You did, yes. On the demolished place of probably the biggest Jewish cemetery in the Sephardic world and in the Balkans. And it was as late, I think so, as 2014 that a memorial was erected on this site, commemorating the Shoah in Greece and the once existence of the cemetery on this site. and you could walk on the Jewish tombstones when walking in the university, actually.
How would you say is the remembrance today about the Holocaust in Greece?
It's very vivid. It has nothing to do with the situation before the 1980s. Until that moment, like in other countries, I think Jews did not speak about what had happened to them. So we have the silence of the victims. At the same time, Greece had to, the official Greek historiography and Greek society had to reconcile with the very sad legacy of the civil war. So most countries in Europe celebrate the liberation, but in Greece we celebrate the beginning of the Second World War because there was no, because the liberation in Greece is completely coupled with the beginning of the bloody 4-year civil war. And it's interesting to know that the first historians who dealt with the history of the occupation and the Shoah were foreigners, Mark Mazauer, Hagen Fleischer. They were not Greeks. And when Greece reconciled somehow with its past and the national resistance was recognized, then we have a slow rebirth of studies bringing to the surface the history of the Second World War, and with it, the history of the Shoah. 1980s it starts, and as of the 1990s, we proceed to witnessing many publications concerning the history of the Jewish community of Thessaloniki, the history of the Shoah in Greece. As of 2000, the Jewish Museum in Athens, in cooperation with the Ministry of Education, the General Secretariat of Religious Affairs, organizing many seminars for teachers every year who want to teach the Holocaust in their lessons. And it's much more present in the public discourse, the Holocaust, than what it used to be 40 years ago.
Yeah, thank you very much for all that you shared with us. It was very interesting and fascinating to talk to you. And thank you.
Yes, thanks. It was a great pleasure.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot, Maria. This was a very interesting talk. And for our listeners, stay tuned. In our next episode, we are going to discuss the case of the neighboring country. It's going to be Bulgaria.